Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fourth annual event of Ideas for India, the panel discussion on 2 years of the Narendra Modi government. We have three very distinguished panelists. In order of seniority, I'll start with Professor Pranab Bardhan, sitting next to me. He's professor of economics in the University of Berkeley. He's one of the leading names in the field of economic development. Our next panelist, Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, he's president, Center for Policy Research, and I think nobody will dispute me saying that he's one of the leading public intellectuals in India. Our third panelist is Mihir Sharma, who I believe is on Bloomberg View right now. Yes. Before that, he was opinion editor in Business Standard. Mihir has quite rightly has acquired a reputation as India's one of most incisive and hard-hitting financial journalists. We originally had a fourth speaker to round this off. That was Ashok Malik, but he had to drop out at the last moment. There's a very well-known saying, I think attributable to Keynes, that if you put two economists in a room, you'll get at least three opinions. So we have two economists and one political scientist here. So by that arithmetic, we should still have 4 opinions. And I hope the economists will not disappoint on that count. So the first question, the obvious thing, which is that, looking at the last 2 years and the general direction in which things are going, do you see any major changes in policy and governance? Now, obviously, there will be little changes here. There will be some continuity. But are there any course changes, sort of major differences in philosophy or approach in these matters? Now, let me highlight one particular aspect of this. Before the election, there was a lot of debate, and one thing which I think came out in the writing a lot of people, it was a desire to see a sort of more market-centric, market-friendly approach to policymaking. There was a sense that the UPA, in spite of the liberalization of the 1991, was sort of intellectually trapped in a more statist, a more welfare-centric, a more regulatory approach to governance. And to put it somewhat dramatically, some people were hoping for maybe a Reagan or Thatcher sort of revolution in India, where there will be a greater receptiveness to markets, to business, to the price mechanism, as opposed to sort of planning sort of solutions. So as far as that view is concerned, do you see any confirmation or vindication that there has been a shift in government policy? So, Pranab.
Yes, when you first started the question, I thought you were talking about broad changes, but now the latter part of your question tells me it's mostly about the economic policies that you're looking for. I would say economic policies, there's much less change compared to the earlier regime. If you ask me about social policy, cultural policy, in general, the democratic atmosphere in India, I would have said that there's a significant change for the negative. But for the moment, let me talk about the economy. Economy, yes, some people thought there will be a big change in this government as Mr. Modi as the big harbinger of market reform. I don't know where that impression came. They're always what Lenin used to talk about, or at least the expression is attributed to Lenin, useful idiots. Useful idiots is to think that, yes, there will be big market reforms. But I don't know how they got this impression. If you look at Mr. Modi's years in Gujarat as a chief minister, most of it shows that he was business friendly, but not necessarily market friendly. In fact, if you follow Gujarat's development, Gujarat had a very high rate of growth. But if you follows that development, there are more a large number of capital subsidies to many of these groups, like the Adanis, like Ambanis, like Esser, and so on. These are business-friendly measures, not necessarily market-friendly. Now, of course, there are some incremental market changes. And in a way, after he came to Delhi, I see incremental changes, but not a big change. And I think he himself is quite open about it. In a recent interview with the Wall Street Journal, his economic philosophy, to the extent it comes out of that interview, is quite statist. He wants the state to be very important. And he, in fact, said, what kind of reforms are you talking about? But there have been incremental changes. I would say many of the policies are continuation of the earlier regime, but there have been incremental changes. For example, the bankruptcy code. For example, the more opening to FDI. For example, crop insurance in agriculture. And I could give you 4 or 5 other such policies, which I would regard as changes, but somewhat incremental. The issue, I would have said, if you look at macroeconomic policy, which is what financial press most of the time talk about, think of a counterfactual. Suppose Mr. Modi did not come to power. UPA regime continued with Mr. Chidambaram as the finance minister, continuing. Mr. Raghuram Rajan continuing as the governor of the Reserve Bank. The global situation continuing, bleak situation in terms of world markets and global slowdown, with the good fortune of oil prices and some other commodity prices going down, and the bad fortune of 2 drought years. If you think of that counterfactual, and whereas some of the other things remaining the same, considering all this, I would have said the macroeconomic situation would not have been very different, given these constraints and given the counterfactuals. So I don't see a big change, neither in the macroeconomy nor in these other policies. However, and let me end with this, there are some changes in the wrong direction, even though not a big change, but let me mention a couple of changes which are in the wrong direction. Incremental, but still in the wrong direction. One is, I would say, relating to environmental clearances. In the last 2 years, there have been a large number of rather quiet changes in environmental regulation, in green clearances. A great deal of relaxation have been going on. In fact, I find the only journalist in India who's keeping regular track of it. Almost every week, he's citing these changes in the wrong direction. And this is Mr. Nitin Sethi in Business Standard. And he sends me his columns, and I see almost every week how many changes quietly are going on in relaxation of environmental clearances. Some of them may be justified, but most of them are not. So that's one change in the wrong direction, I would say. Forest Rights Act. I don't know how many of you know the tribal rights on land, which was the Forest Rights Act, have been quietly watered down and in some cases cancelled. In Chhattisgarh, for example, forest rights have been largely watered down in favor of a company which is a joint enterprise between Adani Mines and a Rajasthan Electric Corporation group, etc. I could give you other examples, mainly derived from Nitin Sethi's account. The other change in the wrong direction is a much bigger thing, and potentially a much bigger thing, and that is in health. Toward the end of the UPA regime and in the beginning months of the new regime, there was quite a bit of talk of moving towards universal health care. That seemed to be, nobody's talking about that. In fact, on the other hand, we've got some documents now from Niti Aayog, which is going in the opposite direction, going more for private health insurance. subsidize private health insurance or more of the United States kind, which in my judgment is the wrong, highly defective, and prohibitively expensive healthcare. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that we can follow fully like the National Health Service in Britain or the National Health Service in France. But we can look at a neighboring country, Thailand. Thailand, from the early days, for about more than 10 years now, they have introduced a universal health care and at a reasonable expense. It's not that it's enormously expensive. I think we should have gone in that direction, but it looks like in the last year or two, the Modi government is showing, they have not implemented anything, showing opposite direction. In fact, in the last budget, there seemed to be the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, which used to get 30,000 subsidy per patient. The last budget has been announced to be increased to 100,000 or something. But if you hear about some of the horror stories of the RBY, this Swasthya scheme, because the government is giving 30,000 rupees subsidy, the number of surgeries in India have gone up tremendously. In fact, you hear horror stories of hysterectomies done on young women, quite often unnecessarily. You also look at the cesarean births in India. I hear accounts, they have suddenly shot up. And not all of it, but some of it must be due to, for the doctors trying to grab this 30,000 rupees, which probably are going to be increased to be 100,000 rupees very soon. So this is, to me, is not the right way. And this is one of the two examples I wanted to give about changes, but not in the right direction.
Gosh, it's such a big question. And, to be honest, these discussions are very frustrating because, we can do the glass half empty, my 5 favorite horror stories, my 3 steps forward. So let me kind of step back a bit and ask a couple of questions, and maybe we can sort of take this up, right? So first of all, I think we have to acknowledge 2 things. And I think if you have to advance economic discussion, I think it is worth talking about those. The first is that this government did inherit an economy that was in far worse shape than we actually thought, which is the foundations that were, in a sense, rotting institutional foundations of the economy, whether via crony capitalism, the structure of the banking system, were far, far worse than we thought. And I think we were all complicit in actually not making it clear later on. The second larger conceptual point is I'm actually not sure what the conceptual framework is, not just in government, but outside government, that we bring to bear when we think about what is the right kind of reform to make. There was a narrative post-1991, reform means getting the state out of things. I mean, that was at best a self-defeating narrative. It didn't ask the hard questions of where do you need to get the state in rather than where do you need to get the state out. I think the list that economists had of priority items that needed to be reformed, I mean, we spent so much political and intellectual capital on the Land Acquisition Act. This government spent so much political capital and was defeated. It's completely beside the point, to be honest. There's a lot more discussion around should labor have been the big priority. I'm not actually convinced, based on what business says, what the de facto practices of labor are, that is actually the highest priority, right? So I think, and I think what has happened to economic discussion in this country is that it has become really a debate about cutting down or raising up. I mean, there's no framework, that we actually bring to bear to this. So one way of thinking about what this government is doing, and then you can judge it by its own, is to say that, look, I agree with Pranab, this government was not going to be a market. I mean, I don't even know what that actually means. Market friendly also means doing a lot of things with the state, right? So you begin with one question, which is what is going to make India competitive? What are the foundations of that? One pillar of that is energy. You could say the glass is half full with this government. I think its achievements are being exaggerated. I think with coal auctions, all of this, it set itself up for problems down the line. But you have to say there's been also a lot of movement on energy, right? Energy, I mean, if they do nothing else but do 24/7 power in 7 years, it'll be a huge achievement, right? So energy is the first building block. I mean, without energy, you don't have a future, right? And there have been, I mean, I think the renewable energy target with all its problems is ambitious, right? That was the first sort of pillar of that. The second pillar of that competitiveness is logistics. I mean, how can India hope to be a competitive economy if our logistics costs are, you know, even way higher than the United States is, right? That's the infrastructure story, where, again, you could say the glass is probably half full. The road stuff will start gaining momentum. The port stuff is beginning to actually happen, right? That's the second pillar of that competitiveness. The third pillar of that competitiveness is human capital, where, to put it mildly, this government has been a walking disaster, right? But to be fair, we haven't had a government in India that has actually been anywhere remotely sort of full marks, or not even full marks, even kind of remotely above the disaster level on. In fact, the decimation that UPA did of higher education still needs to be acknowledged, right? But let's say human capital 0, right? The fourth element of that, in a sense, competitiveness, right, is what you might call the kind of broader institutional framework, right? And you can divide the institutions into different kinds of functions. There's sovereign functions. The last election was fought on the theme of institutional regeneration, right? Corruption is a proxy also for institutional regeneration. And you can say on institutional regeneration, we have basically exacerbated all the bad tendencies that had been hardwired into our governance systems. If you see what is happening with the National Investigative Agency, what is happening with the CBI, right? What's happened with Article 356, as the courts have pointed out, on all those basic foundational institutional questions. Again, these were all misused prior to this government, but I think all that this government has done is even more hardwired, right? Those institutional pathologies. Second manifestation of that institutional thing was crony capitalism. Let me put it this way, I do think the government does recognize, and in fact I think that recognition has tied its hand, that a major scandal would be a political disaster for the government. So to that extent, I think there is a change in at least a certain culture of presentation about how you represent the relationship between state and business. And some of that is in a sense probably genuine. But the core question of the relationship between state and capital, right, I think is still very much an open question in India. And I have to say, not just because the state has not fully got its act together, but I think actually Indian capital is not ready for a market-friendly system. Indian big capital is not. In fact, I think the state will be reformed far more probably than actually Indian big capital is ready for. And the final element of that institutional architecture was these big changes, right? Cooperative federalism, decentralization. Decentralization has gone out of the window. The government came with a great deal of enthusiasm about cooperative federalism, 14 Financial Commission recommendations. But, you know, will there be a robust discussion of the 73rd Amendment, 74th Amendment? Will smart cities lead to genuine devolution of city government? All those big questions that were part of that institutional architecture, they are basically off the agenda. And the final thing, which is on the economic thing, which is, I do think this government was right in recognizing no country in the world has grown without an industrial policy. The United States had an industrial policy. I mean, you know, in our conventional readings of state versus market, we don't like to represent it as such, right? I think credit to it that it did bring that on the agenda. It did ask questions about how can you leverage defense expenditure for manufacturing capabilities. It did ask questions about we will have to take sectoral bets, textiles and so forth, how far we, right? It's just not done a very convincing job of showing that it has the capabilities of actually executing a 21st century industrial policy.
Okay, so let me take a third tack and try and look very closely at exactly what the differences between this government and the last government could be. Because if you're going to ask yourself the question, in the counterfactual manner it was posed, are we actually going off in a different direction than had been set over the past 10 or 15 years, or 10 or 15 years prior to Narendra Modi becoming Prime Minister? It's a little difficult to make the case that we are. Let's give you the couple of directions that are perhaps new, economically speaking. The first is, and as Pratap said, there's a recognition, not just in this government, but I think across the political class more broadly, that easy to understand and easy to demonstrate corruption is no longer politically advantageous, all right? So it can come back and hit you. So you will have everyone from Narendra Modi to Sonia Gandhi to Lalu Prasad to Mamata Banerjee, it doesn't matter what their histories, what their proclivities may be, they'll all have the same approach right now because of the 2010 to 2014 period to anything that smacks of corruption. So what does this mean? Does this mean that we are moving in a direction that is substantively different from the one that we had earlier? I would argue not, because in fact the underlying base for the corruption-free administration that we would like to imagine we now have was already being put into place, whether because of the politics of 2010 to 2014, whether because of Supreme Court judgments, or because of any number of other things. No government could have handed over natural resources the way that had been the case from 1990 till 2010. No government could have had completely transparent, untransparent and unaudited expenditure of the sort that we had in the Commonwealth Games again. There would be a certain acceptance that that period of our political history and our political economy was over. So we were already in that direction. So I wouldn't argue that this is a substantively different direction. What else can we say that we have seen differences in? I think the other thing that we could claim was different was federalism. We saw a big devolution of financing to the states at the end of the 14th Finance Commission Award. But once again, it's difficult to claim that this is a new direction that has been put into place voluntarily by the new government. This is something that not, first of all, responded to the political direction of this country. Politics in this country is now mainly done in the states. Secondly, it's a response to how policy can efficiently be implemented. Centrally sponsored schemes, it turns out, depended crucially on state government buy-in, so why not give them greater control of it? And finally, it really wasn't something that this particular government had a choice over. All right, it's very difficult to turn down or to refuse to accept the award of a finance commission. So in all ways, once again, I think on federalism, you've seen that you already were heading in a particular direction, and the government continued to go down it, or not, as Pratap might argue. So what is it that then we expected would be the new direction that it chose, and are we right to feel disappointed? Well, now I think we have to examine very carefully, as Professor Bardhan did, exactly what was expected of Mr. Modi and whether those expectations were justified. And yes, I think he was expected to be a Thatcher by many people, but I think a lot of those people hadn't bothered to actually read any of his speeches or examine very carefully what he had said and done in Gujarat, or in fact what he was on the campaign trail promising. And his promises were not very different from anything that had been promised by any government or any political party in the years previous. His only additional promise was that he would do it more efficiently, more cleanly, and more effectively. All right? So in other words, even Narendra Modi was promising, I'm not going to vastly change the direction in which we are moving, I'm just going to get you there faster. Now, whether or not he's getting us there faster is not something, maybe something that we can discuss in a subsequent question. But it is fundamentally unfair, I think, of us to have expected that he would completely change the way that government operates in this country or the way that the economy is structured in this country. That was not what he thought he was being elected to do. It was not what he had done in Gujarat. It was not what he was promising to do. And frankly, under this state organization and given the current constraints, it is not something that he is capable of doing. Furthermore, it is not something he is willing to do. I would argue that changing the way that the economy functions in this country needs us to first change the way that the state operates. And administrative reform is something that was, as I always point out, the subject of the first speech of Manmohan Singh, the first big speech of Manmohan Singh in 2004, and then they did nothing about it. So at least they understood it was important. I don't think Mr. Modi even understands it is important. I think if he understood it was important to change the way that administration happens, to reduce the salience of the tenured civil service, to bring other people in, to change the way that files move, something as simple as that, then he would have done it. But I don't think he believes that that's the problem. So,
you don't think files moving on Twitter is a big change?
Well, I'll admit that that's a change. But so I do not think, essentially, that he believes that this is worthwhile to do. I don't think he thinks it's a priority. He's never talked about it. He just tells civil servants to work harder. And I really don't think the problem is that our civil servants aren't working hard enough. I think it's the structure of that they operate in that is the problem. And unless you change that or want to change that, I don't think we're really going to ever go in a different direction.
Okay. I must admit that I'm already feeling Ashok Malik's absence here. We did hire a defense lawyer. He just didn't show up in the courtroom.
I'll take his positions in subsequent. I can ventriloquize for Ashok very, very well.
Okay, we'll really need that.